Hello! I've just come back from a little run ashore and a great swim in the Atlantic. I'm in Playa de Vitoria in the Azores. And while I was swimming here, I was thinking that it's impressive that just 3 miles offshore here from the island of Terceira, it's thousands and even more meters deep. So these are really volcanic islands. And despite the fact that it's in the middle of the Atlantic, there are hardly any tides. I mean, the range between high water and low water here is just a meter, and still it is considered tidal, and there are very benign currents. And then in Northern Europe, oh my God, you can have tidal races and speed up to 8 knots and ranges of 12 meters. So why is it so much there and so little here? So I've done a couple of videos which I wanted to share with you. Some videos about first the background, how the tides are there and why they are so different places. So you grasp the big picture of the Atlantic breathing in and breathing out twice a day. So you can get a picture, a holistic view of the whole thing. And then in the second video, we'll go in and have a look how the charts and how the books are printed. So what reference are they having? Can you sail safely in tidal waters? And maybe it says that you can't go into an harbor, and yet if you have a little bit tidal waters on top of it, maybe you can get in there. And in the third video, we'll look a little bit more specific, because there are harbors which are really tricky to get in. And then you have to do secondary port calculations. Oh, everybody is scared of them. But it's not that difficult, because I have developed a template. On one A4 page, I have gathered all what you need to calculate for tidal calculations. So it's not that difficult. And then we'll go and have a look at the currents, because the currents are moving you, and you have to navigate with the currents, and sometimes you have to calculate the course to steer, and sometimes an estimated position. And in the last video, we'll have a look at anchoring. So you take the height of tide into consideration, so you don't run aground or you have too little chain out. So these are a couple of videos I'd like to share with you. So follow me now for the first one, which is about the theory behind it and understanding the holistic view of the tides. Before we dig into tidal sailing in style, doing it the easy, the safe and the comfortable way, using the templates I've been developing, let's go and look a little bit what the tides are coming from, so we'll see the big picture, so you understand where we are in relationship to the tides and what they're doing and why. Because if you look here over the Earth, this is the chart seen from the Pacific, you can see the tidal ranges. So it differs in various places. So it means if we are in a blue area, the tidal range isn't very much to consider. And then it goes over to green, and the red and dark brownish ones, these are the interesting parts. And the interesting thing is that if you live where I do in Europe, back up here in the right top corner, it is really getting red and brownish. And you can really wonder why this is so. And then you have to live with it. If you sail in the Mediterranean or in the Baltic, there is not much tide to consider. It's even considered non-tidal by the RYA. So in the Mediterranean, as I said, it's 0.2 to 0.3 meters, that's about a foot. And in the Baltic, it's really negotiable. Or better, it is overshadowed by other means of forces that changes the water direction, the water height, which I will talk about. But the tides, they are becoming really interesting in this area. 1 to 6 meters in the North Sea, 1 to 8 meters in Scotland, 4 to beefy 12 meters in the English Channel. This is the area I enjoy sailing in. And this is the area where you can take a lot of benefit from playing the tides, as they say in Britain. So this little video is about, if you dare to go there, how you handle this in an easy and comfortable and safe way, sailing in tides in style. Why are there so much tides in Europe? Here's a chart which I have used or taken from my Time Zero computer program. That's a navigation program.
which are used from a day-to-day basis, and they give a color coding for the depth of the sea. So you can see the ridge there to the left going from Iceland down to the Azores and further down to the Canaries. That is a red backbone almost of a bit more shallow waters. These are the volcanoes sticking up. These are the shelves moving against each other. And that's where you have all these islands I was just speaking about. And then you have the deep blue sea, where the blue water sailors love watching the blue sea and the blue skies, deep water, a couple of kilometers deep. And then the red part in the northeastern corner here, around the British Isles and the North Sea, and also the Baltic. It's very, very shallow. In the Mediterranean, you have some really deep patches, and around Greece, it's again shallow, but it's all a very confined area with only one opening in Gibraltar, where European continent and Africa meet in a little tiny opening, letting water in and out from the Atlantic. So why is it so? Well, the water depth is very much smaller. So that means that all the water that is moving in the deep blue Atlantic has to continue moving over shallow waters. So that means that if a lot of water is suddenly only having a very small depth to move over, a couple of 100 meters compared to thousands of meters, of course this movement becomes accelerated because the water needs to move. And then you have in Northern Europe all these sounds. I mean, the sound between Great Britain or England and France, the English Channel, that's a sound. So all the water is not only shallow there, about 60 meters, it also needs to be pressed through the English Channel to get through to the North Sea. The same applies between Ireland and Great Britain or England there, that the water needs to go through. And not only sounds, you also have peninsulas. Peninsulas are sticking out noses, so to speak. I mean, Scotland is one of those. The Pentland Firth and Capbrath are notorious on the north corner of Scotland, mainland Scotland, where the water needs to go round that corner to get into the North Sea. But you have them everywhere, even along the English south coast. A lot of little bills, as they call it, most famous maybe Portland Bill, where the water needs to be pushed by and make a detour to go through there. And of course Brittany also sticking out its nose. And then the islands. Well, there are a lot of islands, and the water needs to be pushed around these islands as well. So that's nothing compared to the deep blue Atlantic. Resonance is something that is valid in the North Sea area, not so much in the Mediterranean. The resonance is like when you are in a bathtub and you move your hands forward and backward and forward. Well, I used to love this doing as a kid, forward and backward. It becomes very splashy. So by just moving a little child's hand, the water in the bathtub can really accelerate and mother forbid, a lot of water spraying into the bathroom itself. This is the case when your movement to and fro is about the same frequency as the width of the bathtub allows. So if you get into resonance, it can become quite nasty. If you move the hand faster or slower, then it doesn't help. It's like on a swing on a playing ground. You need to push the child exactly the same speed, otherwise you stop him rather than accelerating him. And in the Mediterranean, you don't have that resonance thing. The Mediterranean size is not the correct size for the nice water moving to and fro. So the North Sea is the really interesting part. So how does it work? Well, it works like this. So if we have our Earth here, and I have a little lighthouse on the one side, that's where we are. So we are on the top of the lighthouse, and then we have the moon. The moon, not drawn to scale here, of course, is very close to us. It has a relative small mass, but it is very close. So despite the fact that it is rather small, its closeness to us gives it a huge impact on gravitation. So the gravitation of the moon is rather big. And then we have the sun. Sun here, the yellow big thing. It is much, much bigger in reality and further away. But it has also an influence on the tides, because it has also gravitation. It's huge, the gravitation, because the sun is so big, it has such a big mass, but the distance is so far away from us, so its influence is actually, if you sum these up, a little bit less, or significantly less, than the moon. So the moon wins and the sun is a number 2. But then we have planets, of course, as well, and other objects in the Earth who also influence the tide. So you have a lot of astronomical things, but the further away they are, the less influence they have. Let's play around with the moon being number 1 and the sun being number 2, influencing the tides. So we are up here in our lighthouse. It becomes midday because we turn one turn in 24 hours that we call a day. It's midday. The sun is the highest above us. And if we look up in the sky, we can see the sun. We can't see the moon. It's behind the Earth in this example. The day continues, so it becomes evening. The sun disappears in the west and the moon rises in the east. So at midnight, the moon is clearly above us. Wonderful. We can look up into the sky. It's night, so we can't see the sun. It's behind the Earth. And then we are in the morning again. The sun rises in the east and the moon disappears in the west. So that is 24 hours. And now we have the gravitation of these two celestial objects. So the sun and the moon, they both pull. And what can they pull? Well, they can pull anything which is easily movable on the Earth, namely water. So this is how it actually looks. So the water is thicker where the moon and the sun is pulling them towards their direction. So here in the morning we have very little water, but then when we turn the Earth, and remember the Earth is turning under the water is actually standing still. It is the Earth that is turning. So we turn here under the water, and at midday we have high water. It is almost up to our shoulders. So we have high water at midday. The day continues and it becomes evening. And in the evening we have low water, as you can see. And at midnight we have high water again. So let's write on our little notebook, so we don't forget. We have high water twice a day and low water twice a day, typically, at least in Europe. Now, this picture I drew was not really correct, because it's a little bit more complex, because everything is moving. And the moon has the biggest impact. So let's concentrate on the moon, how that moves. The moon takes about 27 days to go one turn around the Earth. So every day it moves on 1/27th. 1/27th it moves on. So look how it looks. So now I play the next 24 hours, a little bit faster. Here it turns. So by the time we have the moon above us again, which gives the high water, then it has continued 1/27th of a turn. And a 27th is about a 24th, more or less, a little bit more than a 24th. And a 24th of a turn, that's 1 hour, because it takes 24 hours for a whole day. So it has continued a little bit less than 1 hour, because 1/27th is a bit less than a 24th. So a little bit less than 1 hour, about 50 minutes. That means high water the next day is a little bit later than it was the day before. It's only rough. It is so we all understand the principles. That's the important thing. So if you want to know what the high water will be tomorrow, you can say same day as today, just 50 minutes later. All right, so now let's play this through. We have morning, midday, evening, and it continues. It continues for a whole week, and the moon continues, and we are continuing around and do this 7 turns. So now the moon is about a week later. We have a waning half moon because the sun shines onto the moon, and we just see the face lit up by the sun. The rest is dark. So now you can see that the moon is pulling vertically and the sun is pulling horizontally. So the difference is not so big between high water and low water. The moon wins because it's closer to us. So the high water is still where the moon is, but not as high as it was before. And the low water, that is now where the sun is. But all right, the low water is not as low. So the difference between high water and low water is not so significant when you have half moon. After 1 week, after 7 turns, well, they are all in one line again. So now we have new moon. We can't see the moon, it is all black, but they help each other again. So this is what we call spring. So let's write down. So Neap, it's about at half moon. It's about 1 to 2 days later than half moon if you're really exact, but let's call it at half moon. Then the high water is not as high and the low water is not as low. And spring, that is 1 day after full or new moon, then we have very high waters and very low waters. So they help each other. And then you can see one more thing actually, which is interesting. That is that the high water at Neap, that is about at 6-ish in the morning and in the afternoon or in the evenings at 1800. And the high water at spring, that is when we are looking into the sun, or just the opposite at midnight or midday. These are very good things just to have in your backhead. And some people ask, so why is there in this picture now a bulb on the other side? Well, that has to do with the centrifugal forces, because the whole thing is, of course, the Earth is spinning around the sun as well. So you always have 2 bulbs, but one is a little bit bigger than the other. But that is only a minor thing. I found on the internet a nice little illustration here how the Earth, how the moon orbits the Earth. So look at this. It goes around here, and it follows the Earth all the way while it is orbiting the sun. So it's all quite complex. And on the next movie, we have the same picture. Seen from another side, how the Earth is pulling the moon is pulling the water around itself. Do you see that? How the thick bulb of the water is following, and the whole water is it looks as if it is, or feels as if it is moving, but it's really the Earth turning under the water. And this friction, I have actually heard, between the water and the Earth has slowed it down a little bit during the millions of years. But that's another story. Here's another nice illustration to the left, how the moon is orbiting and it pulls the water. It's all exaggerated, but I think you can have that in your backhead, and you can see if there's an island in the middle, or a sound, or a peninsula, how much strange water flow is going around there, and it builds eddies and races and all sorts of nasty things. Yes, a bit exaggerated a bit. And to the right here we have a time lapse of how the water is going up and down. And if you have never seen it, it is quite impressive how water just comes during the day, and then it suddenly just disappears quite as quickly. And it's impressive that all these tons of water can disappear and come again. So everything here, all this is being predicted. You have it all listed in a nice book, or an app of course, and it's called The Reeds. You have books by Imre as well, but The Reeds has such a dominance, and especially because it is being used by the RYA as an example, I will now use The Reeds and have built my templates around The Reeds. But if you use the Imre, it has the same information in there, shown in a very, very similar way. Well, let's look at the tides in Helgoland. Helgoland in November 22, and you open up the page for Helgoland, and then you get a table. So if you look at this table, you can see here on the 22nd that it is 1 day before new moon, because new moon is on the 23rd. The 23rd has a black ball under the W. The W is symbolizing it's a Wednesday, and the black ball tells you that it is new moon. So it's 1 day before new moon and 3 days before spring. Spring is printed in red in reeds. So the 25th is spring. So it's a bit before spring. And here we can see that the high water is at 10:22 and 22:48. If you look here, 10:22, we have 3.1 meters height of tide, and at 22:48 it is 3 meters height of tide. All right, that's interesting. And then looks the next day. Now that's new moon, or 2 days before spring, and the high water is about 50 minutes later. Do you see that? 11:05 and 23:29. So here again you can see that the next high water is about 50 minutes later. And the 24th, that is 1 day before spring, you have high water at 11:47. That's about at midday. And 25th of November, it is springtide. It's a red day, F for Friday, and the high water is at 00:08 and 12:29. It is approximately at midday and midnight. Oh, and let's continue. December. Well, that's close to Neap here. We have actually Neap on the 1st of December, and here we have high water at 5 o'clock and 17:53. So again, you can see that it is enough to look up into the sky and see when we have high water and when we have low water. So this is a full moon. I've taken this picture on the Bay of Biscay somewhere. So that means it's about 1 day before spring, 1 to 2 days before springtime. So that means that high water must be a little bit before midday or midnight. So the high waters here are about 2300 and 11 o'clock, and low water approximately an hour before 6 and 1800. So meaning 5 o'clock or 17 o'clock. And it's springtide. It's 1 day before springtide. So that means that the high water is very high and the low waters are very low. Another example, picture taken by me somewhere. It is about, this moon looks a little bit bigger than half. Can you see that? So let's assume it's about a day after, or 2 days maybe. I think it's 1 day after half moon. So that must be exactly Neap. So that means that we could expect high water being about at 6 and 1800, and low waters then at midday and midnight. And it's neap tides. That means that high waters are not so high, low waters are not so low, and the corresponding current is not so wild and strong. Well, good enough. Let's look at this picture. Here we have, what can this be? Well, it's about a day or two after new moon, isn't it? It's a wonderful new moon. High water would be about at 1 o'clock and 13. That's an hour after midday or midnight, and low water currently an hour after 6 and 18. So 7 o'clock and 19, I would say. And what is this? This is a nice picture I did. Well, don't be misled. That's an eclipse in Ehlers 2015. So that's not the moon at all. That's the sun, actually. And I was very lucky that exactly when we had the eclipse, there was a little hole in the clouds, and I went out and shot it from my boat, actually. Well, back to Europe, back to the tides, back to everything. So here we have the tides, and now let's see how this works. So what you have to imagine is that the earth turns and the whole water is standing still. So that means that the whole water, the whole Atlantic water is from our perspective moving towards us and then moving away. So it's like the Atlantic breathing in and breathing out. And with this breath, with this rhythm, we will live twice a day in and out. So look at this. We have the big wave here. That's the high water coming in. And then it goes here, divides through the English Channel, and it meets up here in Helgoland. So that's what happens when the flood comes. You have to distinguish, by the way, that you have high water and low water I've been talking about, and flood, sometimes misunderstood. Flood is actually the process of increasing, coming water. The water is rising, and ebb is the process of it flowing back where it belongs, back into the Atlantic. And I think it's very good to know the direction of the flood. So wherever you sail, you should always have in your back head the direction of the flood. Which way is it flooding? So when we have had low water and it's becoming high water, which direction does it go? And ebbing is, of course, the opposite direction. So as I showed on that little wave animation, this is the direction of the flood. Comes from the Atlantic and it just bangs against the Portuguese land. It goes into Gibraltar, as you can see, into the Bay of Biscay, and then, very interestingly, on both sides around Ireland and on both sides around Britain. And then it divides up in the North Sea. Some of the flood goes towards Dover and some fills up in Helgoland, in the German Bight, there between where Denmark is touching the German border on the North Sea. And there are two interesting points here, or several interesting points here actually. So here they meet, there they meet, and here it meets the land. So this is where these times are valid, which I said about midday and midnight and so on. So these are the points where the flood ends and then it turns. Interesting points, remember them, between Dublin and Belfast, around Dover, and that's why I think Dover has been picked as one of these important standard ports where so much reference is given, and Helgoland. And Helgoland is also one of these important standard ports where the Germans are taking the reference. But they touch each other there approximately at the same time. So in Dublin, or there in the Irish Sea, and around Dover and around Helgoland, that's where they meet at the same time. And then they turn around and go back again. So let's look at the spring of the 25th of November 22. So let's see when we have high water. So I took the reeds and I looked up some places in the reeds, and I looked up to see when is it high water on that day. So here are the times of high water: 2:40, 3:10, 3:20, 3:30, 4:30, 5 o'clock. So here you can see how these flood is coming. This is when it becomes high water in the corresponding places, and then the high water wave continues, so to speak, into the way the flood turns. And now let's look in the English Channel, because that's a very interesting place. So I have looked up the times of high water here, the spring tides, and the times of high water. So let's first recapitulate how does it work. This is the direction of the flood. This is the water that comes in, and it meets there just north of Dover and in Helgoland. We have the direction of the current varies a lot outside Netherlands, and it doesn't really correspond to these flooding and ebbing time. So you can really now understand why the tides here do not really correlate with the times as they should so much, the direction of the tides. But here are my times. So here are the times, because we had arrived at 5 o'clock here at Brest, or in the Isles of Scilly. And you can see that the times are equivalent: 6 o'clock here and then 7 o'clock there. So it's the same time on both sides of the channel, moving eastbound. So that's 10 o'clock. And here you can see 10 o'clock, it has also already come to the Frisian Islands from Scotland up there. And then we have 11 o'clock, and then we have around 12 o'clock here. So 12 o'clock, that's where it is high water there. And that is the interesting thing, that it is these points that I mentioned, these three, that is where the times are valid that I quoted because of this moon and sun constellation. So at these 3 points, we have, these are the end stations as I call them. We have high water at 12 and 24 if it's spring, and 6 and 18 o'clock if neap, and the corresponding hours before that and the other places. So as you can see, it is where it is 6 o'clock, that's Plymouth approximately, or there in on the north coast of Brittany. That is 6 hours before it is high water in the yellow circles. So with this picture in mind, you can look up in the moon. If you know where you are, you can approximately see when it will be high water and low water. Of course, you can do that all on your apps as well. So here I have Time Zero. Time Zero is my navigation program. So here I have the flooding areas, these yellow arrows. They show here the direction of the current, and it flows into the German Bight, into Helgoland, and further on to Cuxhaven. And here it is the same thing when I have moved my cursor a little bit, and we have the ebbing time. Same thing here in the Irish Sea. This is now flooding. So the water comes from the north and from the south. That's very interesting. And then you have here slack water. Nothing is moving anywhere. So despite the fact that we have completely strong flooding here now, a strong current flooding there, but not here because nothing happens. So then when you ebb, it goes into the opposite direction. So if you're really smart here and you're playing the tides, then you make sure that you are, when you come from south, for instance, then you sail on the flood to this point. Make sure you are at this point exactly at the time of the change of the current direction, namely at high water. So you go on the flood until you get at the time of high water to that place, and then you continue on the ebbing tide on the opposite side. So normally you only have about 6 hours of sailing with the tide, but here at this place and also around Dover, you actually have 12 hours of currents with you if you do it in a smart way. Isn't that cool? So let's sum up some rules of thumb. Rules of thumb which you don't need a reeds or any other tidal almanac for. Tides, the current turns at the high water and at low water. That makes sense. So first the current goes into one direction until it becomes high water, and then it turns in the opposite direction. Approximately. Sometimes at some places, so don't blame me if it is about an hour or so later, it can happen that the high water appears before the current changes. But never mind, it is a rule of thumb. So that means that if you want to sail with the ebb, that means you want to sail in the direction of the ebb. That's why it's so important to know which direction the flood and the ebb goes. So if you are, for instance, on the German north coast and you want to sail westbound, then you sail with the ebb. So if you leave at high water, because at your place it's become high water, and then you want to sail on the ebb, then you should leave at high water and arrive at low water. And if you sail with a flood, that means that along the north coast of Germany, then if you want to sail in eastern direction, well, then you want to sail with the flood. Then you leave at low water and arrive at high water. Another nice rule of thumb that I have already mentioned, you have about 6 hours to sail with the current. And the good news is around high water and low water, you have very little current. And that is actually called slack water. That means that there's hardly any current. And that means that you may, or you can also sail about an hour before or an hour after high and low water, because the current is so weak then. It's the strongest when it's in the middle. So 3 hours before or after high water or low water, it's the strongest current. So in real terms, you can sail about for 8 hours. Okay, the first and last hours you have some counter currents, but it's okay. And 8 hours is a good sailing day, isn't it? So that means that it doesn't really help to fight the currents. It's much smarter to sail with the current, and then you have a full 8 hours to go sailing. And the special benefits in the Irish Sea, as I have mentioned, and around Dover and Calais, if you play the tides, you can sail up to 12 hours with the current. That is fantastic. Well, most ports can be used even at low water. That's an all-tidal port. And if you are new to tidal waters and you don't know anything, you can always go into these harbors. But many ports would be closed for you. And that is a bit a shame, I think. So, because not all ports you can go in and out at low water. And here, that's where the adventure begins.